October 19th, 1944. Mabalacat Airfield, Philippines. Lieutenant Yukio Seki stands before his commanding officer, Admiral Takejiro Onishi, hearing words that will transform warfare forever. His answer will reshape naval combat, claim thousands of lives, and create history's most feared aerial tactic. Stay until the end to discover what Admiral Onishi did after Japan's surrender. His final act will shock you. Before these, do you have any memories of World War II? I wish you good health. The tropical heat presses down on Mabalacat Airfield like a suffocating blanket. Palm fronds hang motionless in the thick October air, the shadows cutting sharp lines across the dirt runway where 23 Mitsubishi 6M0 fighters sit in silent rows. Lieutenant Yukio Seki wipes sweat from his brow, his flight suit already soaked through despite the early morning hour. He's 23 years old, a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Navy Academy's 70th class, and until this moment, he believed he understood what duty meant. Admiral Takejiro Onishi stands before him, the architect of what will become the most controversial military strategy of the Pacific War. The admiral's face carries the weight of Japan's desperate strategic position. The Philippines are falling. The combined fleet lies broken after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American forces advance with seemingly unstoppable momentum, their carriers and battleships forming an armada that outnumbers Japan's remaining naval assets by catastrophic margins. The situation is grave, Lieutenant. Onishi begins, his voice steady despite the words that follow. Conventional tactics have failed us. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, cannot penetrate the American defensive screens. Their radar, their fighter cover, their anti-aircraft fire. It has become nearly impossible to achieve effective bomb or torpedo strikes. Seki listens, his jaw tightening. He knows the statistics. He's watched fellow pilots return from missions with tales of impenetrable walls of flak, of Hellcat fighters swarming like angry hornets, of bombs that miss their targets as ships maneuver at full speed. The Imperial Japanese Navy is bleeding pilots faster than training programs can replace them, and the Americans grow stronger daily. What we propose, Onishi continues, is a special attack corps. Pilots who will load their aircraft with explosives and dive directly into enemy vessels. Human-guided missiles, if you will. One plane, one ship. The certainty of impact eliminates the variables that have plagued our conventional attacks. The words hang in the humid air. Seki's expression shifts from attention to something harder, disbelief mixed with revulsion. He spent years training to be a naval aviator, learning the complex art of carrier operations, navigation, and combat flying. The idea of throwing away that expertise, that training, that life, in a single deliberate crash seems to contradict everything he's learned about military effectiveness. With respect, Admiral, Seki says, his voice controlled but firm. This is cowardly. It's wasteful. A skilled pilot is worth more than any single ship. We should focus on improving our tactics, our training, We don't have time for improvement, Lieutenant. Onishi's interruption is sharp but not angry. The Americans are preparing to invade Leyte. Once they secure the Philippines, they'll have bases within striking distance of the home islands. Every day we delay gives them another foothold, another anchorage, another airfield. Traditional tactics won't stop them, but this could make them pause, make them reconsider the cost of advancing. Seki stares past the Admiral toward the flight line, where ground crews swarm over the Zeros, loading fuel, checking engines, arming guns. Each of those aircraft represents months of industrial effort, each pilot years of training. The mathematics of sacrifice don't align with the mathematics of survival. He thinks of his wife, Mariko, whom he married just months before his deployment. He thinks of the letters she writes, filled with news of rationing, of air raid drills, of the quiet fear that permeates the home front. I need time to consider this, Seki finally says. Onishi nods, expecting this response. You have until tomorrow morning. But understand, Lieutenant, you are my first choice because of your skills, your leadership, your character. The men will follow you. Without you, This program may never achieve the credibility it needs to succeed. The Admiral departs, leaving Seki alone with his thoughts and the weight of an impossible decision. He walks to the edge of the airfield, where the jungle begins its encroachment on human endeavor. Somewhere in that dense vegetation, he knows, Filipino guerrillas operate, feeding intelligence to the Americans, sabotaging Japanese supply lines. The Philippines are hostile territory now, the locals no longer viewing Japan as a liberator, but as an increasingly desperate occupier. That evening, Seki drinks sake with fellow pilots in the officers' quarters. The mood is subdued. Word has spread about Onishi's proposal, though details remain scarce. Lieutenant Commander Asachi Tamai, the air group commander, joins them, his presence bringing a temporary silence to the conversation. The Admiral spoke to you, Tamai says. It's not a question. Seki nods, staring into his cup. He wants me to lead men to their deaths, to set an example of sacrifice that others will follow. He wants you to lead men who might save Japan. Tamai corrects gently. Consider what we face, Yukio. The Americans have dozens of carriers, hundreds of escort vessels. Their production capacity is beyond anything we can match. In a war of attrition, we've already lost. But if we can make them bleed, truly bleed, if we can make every mile toward Tokyo cost them ships and lives beyond what their public will accept, perhaps we force negotiations. Perhaps we preserve something of Japan. And what do we preserve by asking our best pilots to kill themselves? Seki's voice rises slightly, frustration breaking through his usual composure. How does suicide become strategy? Because conventional warfare hasn't worked. Another pilot interjects. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano. I flew at Midway, at Eastern Solomons, at Philippine Sea. I've watched our carriers burn, our pilots fall. The Americans shoot us down before we get close enough to drop our torpedoes. But playing at full speed, diving from above, that's almost impossible to stop. Physics becomes our weapon. The conversation extends deep into the night. Arguments circle like the mosquitoes that plague the tropical base. Some pilots agree with Seki's initial assessment, that suicide tactics represent desperation rather than innovation, cowardice dressed in patriotic language. Others see the strategic logic, the terrible mathematics that suggest one pilot's life might equal hundreds of American sailors if the attack succeeds. By dawn, Seki has made his decision, though it sits heavy in his chest like undigested food. He finds Admiral Onishi on the headquarters veranda, watching the morning mist burn off the runway. I will do it, Seki says without preamble, but not because I think it's honorable, and not because I want to die. I'll do it because you've convinced me there's no other way to protect the homeland, because my wife and the people of Japan need someone to make this sacrifice. But understand, Admiral, I accept this mission with a heavy heart. Onishi's relief is visible but controlled. Your honesty does you credit, Lieutenant. The Shimpu Special Attack Corps will launch with you as its leader. Choose your pilots carefully. They must be volunteers. I will not order men to their deaths. The formation of the first official Kamikaze unit begins immediately. Seki selects 23 other pilots, all experienced aviators who understand what they're volunteering for. The aircraft are specially modified, armor removed to save weight, fuel tanks expanded for maximum range, and each Zero loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb beneath its belly. The planes become flying bombs, their pilots the guidance systems that conventional weapons lack. Training is brief and focused. The pilots practice steep diving attacks, calculating the angles and speeds that will make interception nearly impossible. They study silhouettes of American ship classes, learning to distinguish between valuable targets, carriers and capital ships, and lesser vessels. Every briefing emphasizes one message: make your death count for maximum effect. October 25th, 1944. The date arrives with startling speed. Before dawn, Seki and his fellow pilots gather for a final meal of rice, fish, and sake. No one speaks much. The ritual of the hachimaki headbands follows, each pilot tying the white cloth around his forehead, many marked with the rising sun symbol or personal messages to family members who will never read them. Seki writes a brief letter to Mariko. His hand shakes slightly as he forms the characters, knowing these will be his final words to her. He doesn't write about glory or honor. Instead, he tells her about their first meeting, about the way sunlight caught in her hair, about his hope that she'll remarry and find happiness after the war. He seals the letter and hands it to Tamai, who promises its delivery. The sound of aircraft engines warming up fills the pre-dawn darkness. Ground crews make final checks, their movements efficient despite the emotional weight of preparing aircraft they know won't return. Seki climbs into his Zero's cockpit, settling into the familiar seat, his hands moving through the pre-flight checklist, with muscle memory earned through hundreds of hours of flying. At 0630 hours, the first wave takes off. 5 zeros, engines roaring, lifting into the gray dawn sky. Seki leads them north toward Leyte Gulf, where American invasion forces have assembled in overwhelming strength. The flight takes them over dense jungle, over mountain ridges shrouded in morning fog, toward the vast expanse of ocean where the U.S. Navy's Task Group 77.4 operates. The Americans call it Taffy 3, a collection of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. These aren't the fleet carriers that Seki might have preferred as targets, but they're valuable nonetheless. Each escort carrier operating 28 aircraft that support the Leyte invasion. Sinking even one would disrupt American air operations and send a message about Japan's continuing resistance. At 1047 hours, Seki spots the American formation. The ships steam in a circular defensive pattern, their radars already detecting the incoming Japanese aircraft. Within seconds, American fighter patrols turn to intercept Grumman F-6F Hellcats diving from altitude with speed and firepower advantages that make them deadly opponents. The Zero formation breaks, each pilot choosing his final moment. Anti-aircraft fire erupts from the American ships, black puffs of flak bursting across the sky, tracers arcing upward in streams of deadly light. One Japanese plane explodes mid-approach, victim to a direct hit from a 5-inch shell. Another trails smoke, its pilot struggling to maintain control as he presses his attack. Seki ignores the chaos, focusing his vision on a single target, the escort carrier USS St. The ship turns hard to starboard, trying to present a narrow profile, but Seki compensates, adjusting his dive angle. His Zero accelerates toward terminal velocity, the wind screaming past the canopy, the altimeter unwinding rapidly. At 300 meters, he knows nothing can stop him now. The physics are inevitable. The impact occurs at 1053 hours. Seki's Zero strikes St. Lo's flight deck at approximately 500 kilometers per hour, penetrating through to the hangar bay where aviation fuel and armed aircraft create a catastrophic secondary explosion. The carrier shudders, massive fireballs erupting from her hull, secondary explosions tearing through compartments below deck. Within 30 minutes, St. Lo lists heavily. At 1,125 hours, she capsizes and sinks, taking 113 American sailors with her. Seki's death achieves what conventional attacks could not. He has destroyed a warship with absolute certainty, proving Admiral Onishi's terrible theory correct. News of the success reaches Mabalacat airfield within hours. Onishi receives the report with mixed emotions, satisfaction that the tactic worked, and sorrow for the men he sent to die. But military logic overrides sentiment. The sinking of St. Lo validates the Kamikaze concept, and Onishi immediately orders expansion of the Special Attack Corps. Within weeks, Kamikaze operations become systematic. Pilots volunteer in numbers that shock even the Japanese high command. Some are motivated by genuine patriotism, others by peer pressure, and many by the simple desire to make their inevitable deaths meaningful. The cult of Bushido, the samurai code emphasizing honor through sacrifice, provides cultural framework for accepting suicide tactics. The Americans struggle to counter the threat. Radar provides warning, but limited time for response. Fighter patrols increase, but determined kamikaze pilots press through losses that would turn back conventional strikes. Anti-aircraft fire grows denser, ships clustering together for mutual protection. But physics favors the attacker. A Zero diving at full speed presents a target that gunners have perhaps 10 seconds to stop, and even a damaged aircraft might complete its dive through sheer momentum. The statistics become horrific. At Okinawa in spring 1945, nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties strike American forces. The destroyer USS Laffey survives 22 separate kamikaze attacks in a single day, her crew firing continuously until ammunition runs low and barrels glow red from heat. The carrier USS Bunker Hill suffers 2 kamikaze hits that kill 389 sailors and wound 264 more. The carrier USS Franklin, hit by bombs from a suicide aircraft, suffers 807 dead and 487 wounded, the worst casualty toll on any U.S. warship that survived the war. American sailors developed psychological trauma from the constant threat. Unlike conventional air attacks that might be evaded or outrun, kamikazes are guaranteed to press home their attacks. Radar operators watch blips approach with the certain knowledge that the pilots guiding those aircraft seek death as eagerly as the Americans seek survival. The stress manifests in combat fatigue, in dreams of burning ships, in the haunted eyes of men who've seen friends torn apart by explosions that shouldn't be humanly possible to deliver. By war's end, kamikaze attacks account for 4,900 American casualties, more than the number of Japanese pilots who flew those missions. The exchange ratio that Admiral Onishi sought has been achieved, though at costs that extend beyond mere numbers. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained, diverts resources to kamikaze operations. Experienced pilots who might have trained the next generation instead die in single missions. The moral implications poison post-war reconciliation efforts, as the world struggles to comprehend how a modern military embraced tactics that seem medieval in their disregard for human life. Lieutenant Yukio Seki never witnessed the consequences his reluctant acceptance created. His moment of impact with USS St. lasted perhaps 1/10 of a second, long enough for fire and steel to merge, for physics to render flesh irrelevant, for his life to end with the certainty he'd been promised. Whether he experienced regret in those final microseconds, whether he thought of Mariko, or of Japan, or of nothing at all, remains unknowable. His legacy, however, is brutally clear. The first organized kamikaze attack proved that suicide tactics worked, at least in the narrow military sense of exchanging one life for disproportionate damage. That success doomed thousands of Japanese pilots to follow his example, creating a precedent that would haunt aviation warfare for generations. The divine wind, the kamikaze, that supposedly saved Japan from Mongol invasion in the 13th century had returned, but this time brought only destruction without deliverance. Historians continue debating whether Seki's actions represented courage or waste, whether Admiral Onishi's strategy was brilliant or monstrous. The truth likely encompasses both extremes. In October 1944, faced with military catastrophe and limited options, Japanese leadership embraced tactics that violated every principle of preserving trained personnel. They asked young men to volunteer for certain death, and enough agreed to create a suicide corps that remains warfare's most disturbing innovation. The kamikaze phenomenon ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945. Admiral Onishi, architect of the strategy, committed ritual seppuku on August 16th, refusing medical treatment and taking 15 hours to die from his self-inflicted wounds. His suicide note apologized to the kamikaze pilots, expressing hope their sacrifice would lead to lasting peace. Whether that sacrifice was necessary, whether it achieved anything beyond prolonging a war Japan had already lost, remains contested. Mariko Seki received her husband's final letter months after his death. She never remarried, despite Yukio's urging, instead maintaining a small shrine in his memory until her own death in 1991. She gave occasional interviews about her husband, always emphasizing his reluctance, his fundamental disagreement with the tactic he helped legitimize. In her telling, Yukio was not a fanatic but a professional officer who accepted an impossible order because he believed Japan's survival demanded it. The USS St. wreckage rests in 4,000 meters of water off Samar, a war grave holding the remains of Yukio Seki and 113 American sailors, enemy warriors joined in death by the violence of October 25, 1944. Modern sonar has located the site, but no recovery operations are planned. The carrier and her dead serve as underwater monument to the day when one pilot's reluctant acceptance created history's most feared aerial weapon. The Kamikaze legacy extends beyond World War II. Suicide tactics appear in asymmetric warfare, in terrorism, in conflicts where weaker forces adopt desperate measures. Each instance echoes Admiral Onishi's terrible logic that certain death, deliberately embraced, can achieve effects impossible through conventional means. The ethical questions persist, debated in military academies, in philosophical texts, in the memories of those who witnessed the divine wind firsthand. Lieutenant Yukio Seki called suicide tactics cowardly and wasteful before agreeing to lead the first kamikaze mission. History suggests his initial assessment was correct. The divine wind sank ships and killed thousands, but couldn't alter strategic reality. Japan lost the war despite kamikaze operations, perhaps lost it faster because resources poured into suicide attacks instead of rational defense planning. The courage of individual pilots cannot redeem the bankruptcy of the strategy they executed. Yet understanding requires acknowledging the context, the desperation that makes impossible choices seem necessary, the cultural frameworks that transform suicide into sacrifice, the military calculus that measures lives against strategic objectives. Yukio Seki's story isn't simple heroism or simple waste. It's the tragedy of a capable officer forced into choosing between personal conviction and national duty, between survival and sacrifice, between rejecting madness and enabling it through reluctant participation. His choice created the Kamikaze Corps. His death legitimized suicide tactics. His reluctance was overwhelmed by forces larger than individual conscience. And 4,900 American casualties later, plus thousands of Japanese pilots, the divine wind finally subsided, leaving behind questions about warfare, morality, and the terrible things nations ask their warriors to become when desperation overtakes reason.